The David is Michelangelo's most celebrated sculptor, possibly the most popular of all time. It depicts the Old Testament figure from the story of David and Goliath. Merely stating the statue's grandeur and intricate detail is insufficient to explain its status as a masterpiece, as other artworks, such as Bernini's Hercules or the Venus de Milo, are equally magnificent. However, when we speak of Michelangelo, we are referring to an artist still considered one of the three greatest of all time. For some, David is not just a masterpiece but the sole masterpiece, unparalleled by any others. The battle between David and Goliath is recorded in the Old Testament, a scripture shared by both Judaism and Christianity. The Jewish people, the chosen ones, arrived in the promised land of Israel and came into conflict with the Philistines. At that time, Philistine territory stretched from what is now the Gaza Strip to Jaffa. To resolve this land dispute, the Philistines proposed a single combat duel between their best warrior, a giant named Goliath, and a Jewish champion. If the Jewish champion lost, their entire tribe would become perpetual slaves to the victors. For a full 40 days, no Jew dared to face Goliath. Young David, a shepherd boy of small stature, stepped forward. Armed with his slingshot, he began the battle. A stone, flying swiftly, struck Goliath in the forehead, causing him to fall face down. David then took Goliath's own sword, cut off his head, and raised it high in a gesture of victory. David in art by different artists. Other artists, such as Titian, also depicted the story of David. Their paintings typically show David after the battle, with Goliath's decapitated body at his feet. Michelangelo's David, however, is more nuanced and original. His David does not portray the moment of victory, but rather the instant before the battle. Goliath is not physically present, but is conveyed through David's gaze, which communicates the giant's position. His eyes are filled with tension and a sense of threat, yet they simultaneously reveal his focus and determination. Another crucial characteristic is that David is completely nude. Sculpting a realistic naked human figure is significantly more challenging than creating a clothed statue. Works by famous Florentine sculptors of the time, such as Donatello and Verrocchio, were often cast in bronze, whereas David is carved from marble, which further enhances its uniqueness. The creation of David is also intimately linked to the political context of Florence at the time. Italy was then fragmented into numerous city-states. Florence was a republic that had experienced periods under the control of the Medici family and the religious rule of Savonarola. After a long struggle for liberty, the Republican government was re-established, but the threat from the Medici family persisted. This political backdrop necessitated multi-layered considerations in the design of the David statue's pose and meaning, the marble block and Michelangelo's method. Furthermore, we must understand that the David statue was not carved from an ordinary stone block, but from a single colossal marble block standing 5.27 meters, approximately 17 feet high and weighing around 6 tons. Even to this day, statues of such immense size are rare, let alone those achieving David's level of precise anatomical detail. To truly appreciate the excellence of David, one must first understand the differences in characteristics between 3D sculptures and 2D paintings. When we observe a painting, even as laypersons, we can simply approach it to appreciate the details and precision of the artwork, just zooming in on the subject and narrative to connect with the artist through understanding. However, a three-dimensional sculpture, being viewable from 360 degrees, demands a more intricate presentation of its subject. Most masters typically began by creating easily moldable and repairable models out of clay or plaster, which their assistants would then scale up proportionally to the stone. However, Michelangelo's direct carving method was different. Most of the time, Michelangelo carved directly into the stone without prior use of living models, clay molds, or casts. This demanded extraordinary physical strength and skill, unlike other sculptors who would work around all faces of the stone to give form to the statue. Michelangelo began carving from one or two sides, progressively revealing his subject. Moreover, Michelangelo held a profoundly unique perspective on sculpture. He believed that the sculptor's role was not to create something from nothing, but rather to reveal what already existed within the stone. Consequently, Michelangelo employed a technique known as subtractive sculpture. He described his carving, stating, "Sculpture is subtractive. Painting is additive." He elaborated that his carving was merely removing the superfluous parts from the stone. As seen in his unfinished statues, the figures appear like butterflies emerging from cocoons, struggling to free themselves from the marble. In 1464, Florence Cathedral commissioned Agostino di Duccio to sculpt a David. In 1465, he personally traveled to the Fantiscritti quarry in Carrara and found a massive marble block over 5 meters long, nearly 2 meters wide, 1.1 meters deep, and weighing over 20 tons. It was transported by ox cart to the port of Pisa, then journeyed by sea and along the Arno River back to Florence. Over the next 7 years, he performed some rough work on this block but stopped due to losing the commission. The stone remained unused in the cathedral courtyard until 1476, when another sculptor, Antonio Rossellino, also attempted to complete the David statue. According to Rossellino, because the stone had already been roughly worked by a previous sculptor, forcing it into a statue would result in a twisted back. Additionally, the front side of the marble had been pierced between the legs, and cracks had begun to appear between what would become David's right arm and torso. For these reasons, he too abandoned the project. By 1499, Michelangelo had already achieved widespread fame for his astonishing Pietà in Rome. Thus, in 1501, a 26-year-old Michelangelo accepted the commission from the Wool Merchants Guild to continue carving David. He also took on this defective marble block. While others only saw defects, he saw an opportunity, despite the marble not being deep enough, having a large hole at the lower front and containing internal cracks. But Michelangelo was confident that no splicing was necessary. This aligned with his belief the form already existed within the marble. "I merely released its soul." Due to the limitations and imperfections of the marble block, Michelangelo had to carve with extreme precision, with no room for error. David was compelled to look to the side because there was insufficient material to allow him to face forward. David also had to adopt a contrapposto stance because the stone's thickness was inadequate, thus making him quite slender. Therefore, a true master is one who can maximize creative space within the most limited conditions. Michelangelo completed the sculpture of David alone in just 2 years, the contrapposto pose and physiological detail. Upon completion, David's standing posture formed a reversed S shape. This represents the contrapposto stance, common in ancient Greek periods. In this pose, the weight of the standing figure is primarily concentrated on one foot. The upper body twists in an S shape from the waist, thereby outlining distinctly different movements between the torso and the front and back legs, imbuing the entire statue with elegance and vibrant dynamism. Red lines on the statue indicate tensed muscles, while yellow lines represent relaxed ones. Most of the weight is borne by one leg, with the other positioned forward, resulting in opposing tilts of the hips and shoulders. The entire torso exhibits a sense of motion within stillness, as if David is about to turn and begin his battle. Michelangelo captured David in his most focused moment as he contemplates the challenge before him. This also demonstrates his concentration and determination before the fight. His muscle lines are flawless. His abdominal muscles are slightly tightened because he is holding his breath in the facing of threat. His veins bulge, reflecting a surge of adrenaline. and his jugular veins are clearly visible, a characteristic physiological response to intense stress. This exemplifies Michelangelo's level of detail and his exacting standards. David is no longer the traditional image of a carefree boy. He is now depicted as a thoughtful, deliberate man. David's neck is tense, his nostrils flared, and his brow furrowed with anxiety. His left hand clasps the slingshot pouch containing a stone, while his right hand firmly grips the handle of the slingshot. The sling strap rests on his left shoulder and hangs behind him, almost imperceptible from the front. This subtly highlights David's victory as a result of wisdom. One might question why David's head and both hands appear abnormally large. However, Michelangelo had dissected numerous cadavers. He understood the structure of the human body better than any doctor, making such an error impossible. In fact, the patrons initially planned to place the statue in a niche on the exterior of the cathedral, some 80 meters 262 feet above ground. This explains why such a large stone block was chosen. It also explains why Michelangelo decided to enlarge certain body parts proportionally. In 2010, a fiberglass replica was temporarily placed in David's originally intended location, clearly demonstrating that when viewed from below, David's proportions appear perfectly balanced. At the time, nudity was uncommon in works depicting biblical stories. However, the Renaissance marked a definitive period for the depiction of nudity in Western art. A renewed focus on ancient Greek and Roman art propelled the portrayal of the human body to the forefront of Renaissance artistic innovation. Achieving excellence in depicting the human form became a standard for measuring artistic talent. Portraying a nude figure was considerably more challenging than depicting a clothed one. However, it is often misunderstood that Europeans during the Renaissance were accustomed to nudity in art, especially when displayed in public. In fact, the elders of Florence even commissioned a garland of 28 gilded copper leaves to cover David's modesty. In later years, he also wore a fig leaf, as illustrated in a photograph from the 1860s. Why was the Jewish hero David not circumcised? This can be traced back to the Renaissance's sources of inspiration, the ancient Greeks and Romans. They considered circumcision a barbaric practice and did not depict it in ancient statues. Concurrently, the Catholic Church condemned circumcision during the Middle Ages. David's Jewish image was merely a representation of the High Renaissance. Some commentators note David's rather small penis, which was seen as a sign of modesty and decorum, indicating that the biblical figure was capable of controlling his desires, in contrast to figures like satyrs or other representations of lustful impulses. David's slightly divergent gaze is rarely noticed. The alignment of his eyes is subtly different. This is a classic Michelangelo technique designed to draw our gaze into David's eyes. The pupils are hollowed out, capturing the ever-changing daylight and making the gaze even more captivating. Michelangelo calculated every angle and always considered the viewer's positional. All these details are exquisitely precise. Michelangelo, who never wasted a minute of his life, worked on David day and night alone, in secret. At night would even put a candle in his hat. He rarely ate, and when he finally slept, he rarely changed and often slept in the same clothes. In 1504, he finally presented his masterpiece to the cathedral committee. They were astonished by Michelangelo's skill and thought it was too perfect to be placed so high up. They decided to find a better location and ultimately chose to place the statue in Florence's political center.
Piazza della Signoria.
Today its replica remains there. A committee member tried to persuade them to place David in a less conspicuous spot. Who was this?
Leonardo da Vinci.
Precisely because David was a true masterpiece, nearly 6 meters tall and weighing 6 tons. 40 men took 4 days to finally move the statue from Michelangelo's workshop to its destination, 800 meters away. As a sign of defiance, David was placed facing south towards Rome, the direction from which the Medici army retreated. It was as if David was saying, "Medici, never come back again." Subsequently, Michelangelo made the final touches on site. The sling and tree stump were gilded. From this reconstruction image, it can be seen that David was enthusiastically welcomed by the Florentines. The 16th century Italian historian
Giorgio Vasari
once wrote, "Whoever has seen this work need not care to see anything else by any other master." In 1873, David was moved to the Accademia Gallery to protect it from environmental erosion and damage. In 1910, a full-size replica was placed in the square to replace the original for display. The covering fig leaf was eventually removed, and people could finally see Michelangelo's original design. Any statue has meaning beyond its initial intent. One person's hero might be a symbol of oppression for another. Michelangelo created many masterpieces, but his miraculous transformation of a shepherd boy into the de facto embodiment of Florence was truly a defining moment in his artistic career. He was an alchemist, turning marble into flesh and blood, and bringing to sculpture unprecedented psychological and physical realism. He died in Rome in February 1564, still working at the age of 88, outliving his artistic rivals Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. He was brought back to Florence and buried in Santa Croce Church, from which it is only a 7 minutes walk to his creation David.